Okay, so we are starting our recording for today. It is the first Tuesday of September, and we are coming from our book that we have been reading from this year as we are gleaning from the women of the Bible. It is called She Speaks, Wisdom from the Bible, Wisdom from the Women of the Bible to the Modern Day Black Women. Last week, we were introduced to the chapter or the book of Esther, and we decided that we were going to go a little bit deeper because that is who's next in our lessons or in our learning. So this week we are discussing Esther. Esther can be found throughout the book of Esther. I told you guys last week, if you had not read the book of Esther, please read it. In this particular book, it says that Esther can be found in chapter 3, verses 5 through 15, in Esther chapter 4. She can be found in those places, absolutely, but I recommend that you read the entire book of Esther. It is not that long. It can take you maybe 30 minutes, 45 if you go down a rabbit hole, an hour at the most to read the book. But I would encourage you to please, please, please read the book of Esther because there's so much wisdom and knowledge that was dropped in there or is dropped in there. I've read that book several times, but every time I read it, I find something new. I glean a different verse out of that. So I'm going to just share with you guys one of the verses that I pulled out today when I was reading Esther. And again, like I said, I've read this so many times. I'll tell you the story, but I'm going to just share with you really quickly. The one thing that stood out to me when I was reading this is it said, no, that one wasn't it. It was, that's not it either. Where is it? I thought I highlighted it. I'm sorry, y'all. Oh, okay. This is what it was. It was Esther chapter 2, verse 18. And it said, the king held a great feast for all of his officials and servants. And it said it was a feast for Esther. I had never seen that in there where it says it was a feast for Esther. It says he remitted his providences from the tax payments and gave gifts according to his royal generosity. Where it says it was a feast for Esther, why that was important to me when I read that today when I was studying earlier is that there were several virgins who were brought to the king. There were several people to whom he could have chosen. We know that he decided to make Esther the queen after Vashti disobeyed him. And we talked about Queen Vashti last week. And let me make sure that was her name, because I really do believe it was Queen Vashti. Yes, Queen Vashti. But in here in chapter 2, where it says it was a feast for Esther, there are so many other things that we can glean from in the book of Esther, but that one thing stood out to me because how many things are we preparing for that are going to be that we will directly be celebrated for? And it's a little sentence in that verse, but it was a feast specifically for her. The king decided to celebrate her, not any of the other versions, not any of the other people, not himself. He decided, I am going to hold a feast specifically for Esther. And so I don't know who needs to hear this, but there is a place and there is a time where there is going to be a feast held specifically for you for no other reason other than you being who you are. And this is why it's so important for us to be who we are. So I'm going to talk about that, but I'm going to go into the Crenshaw version of Esther. We began in the book of Esther last week when we were talking about Queen Vashti. Queen Vashti was the queen of Persia and all these other places. The king's territory was from India to, where does it say? It was from India to a far place. It was a lot. I didn't write that in this one. But he had a very large territory, of which was a part of his kingdom. And when Vashti refused to come to him after a week of festivities and did not come, and he decided amongst those that were with him, they said, well, Queen Vashti has to be put out of your kingdom. She can no longer be the queen, because if she disobeys the king, then all the women will then think that they can disobey their husbands, and we can't have that happening, right? So he said, okay, well, we're going to put Vashti out of the kingdom. He became very like somber and was going through it because he had no woman on his side. So that's when they decided, we'll get some virgins together and you can pick among them who you want. He decided to make Esther the queen. Now, Esther is introduced to us as being an orphan. Her cousin Mordecai was her guardian. Her mother and father passed away. It doesn't say what happened to them, how they passed away, when they passed away, how old she was. It just says she was a young girl and her parents passed away, and her cousin Mordecai decided to take her on and become her guardian. So when Mordecai becomes her guardian, we're seeing that he must have reared her in the correct way and given her the right guidance, because Esther is chosen to be one of these virgins. And not only was she chosen, but she found favor, and she found favor in her beauty. But I don't want to say that it was all of her physical beauty. I think it was the internal beauty in which she had as well, because it couldn't have, we've all seen somebody who looked good, but on the inside, they'd be raggedy and rotten. And so I truly believe that it was the inside of Esther, the beauty that she withheld within her, that exuded to make her external beauty a lot more beautiful. And so she found favor amongst those that were preparing and over the virgins. So as Esther goes on, Mordecai is telling her, don't tell anybody that you're of Jewish descent. Don't tell anybody that you're a Jew. We're going to keep this to ourselves. We're not going to say anything. Okay. So they go on. Mordecai is outside of the king's palace, and he hears two of the servants out there talking about how they were going to conspire to kill the king because he had upset them. So when Mordecai hears this, he sends word back to Esther, and he tells them basically to let the king know. Mordecai said that this is what's going to happen. The king does some digging, finds out that what it said is true. It is written down in a book. That is important. Put a pin there so that you remember that. It's written down in a book that Mordecai warned the king that he was going to be assassinated by those that were working for him. So he goes on, and there was a time where you were supposed to bow down to the king. You were supposed to bow down to people who were within his court. And the Jewish people did not attest to that. Like, the Jewish people did not take that on as a part of what they did, because they truly believed in God. They knew the laws and the regulations. You were to, honor God is first. There should be no other gods before me. You shouldn't bow down to anybody but God, all of these things. So when the time came and they were expecting for the Jewish people to bow down, they wouldn't. And especially Mordecai, because he worked within this inner court. And so Mordecai would not bow down. And so Haman, who was one of the king's inner circle men, saw that Mordecai would not bow down to him. What he said was that basically he went back to the king like, hey, somebody is disobeying your laws. I think that they should be exiled with all of the people who are not obeying the king's laws. They're still not knowing that Esther is Jewish and is a part of these people that they're trying to annihilate. So the king is like, you know what, Haman, I trust you, do whatever it is that you want to do. So Haman becomes very boastful. So Haman goes and he's talking to his wife and he's talking to his friends. And this is why it's important to whom you have around you and to whom you also cleave to and make a covenant with in marriage. Because his wife and his friends, it gives his wife's name, which is not even relevant in us mentioning now because she's not a woman of the Bible that we're studying. But her name starts with a Z. But his wife and friends then come and tell him, like, basically, you should put a gallows up, and that gallows should be done for Mordecai. Like, you should hang him on this, because Mordecai became a thorn in the side for Haman. Like, every time Haman saw him, he just became like angry for the most part. Like, he just did not want to see him. He was he just vexed his spirit. And so when he goes and he tells the king this, the king allows him to write this letter, puts a signet ring, puts his ring on it, which is basically the king's seal. He sends it out to all the people saying basically that the Jewish people are going to be sold, they're going to be annihilated, and that's it. Mordecai tears his clothes. He goes into sackcloth and ashes, and Esther is like, what's wrong? Like, send him some clothes, tell him to get himself together. But Mordecai was grieving so much for what was going to happen that he didn't. So he says, send word back to Esther and tell Esther what is happening. And that is the common phrase that we hear all the time. One of the most widely quoted scriptures of Esther is, you were created, what if you were created for such a time as this? And so Mordecai sends word back to Esther and says, hey, like, you have to go to the king and fight for us. You have to fight for the Jewish people because you are Jewish. If not, your father's house and you shall perish. Because in essence, if he's going to kill all the Jews, he has to also kill Esther. And so at that time, there was a law that if anyone went into the king's courts without being asked to come by the king, unless the king put out his signet, then they would die. They would or his scepter, that they would die. And they would be killed. And so Esther was like, so basically you are setting me up that if the king does not extend his scepter to me, that I will die. Like, that's a tricky thing. So what she tells him is that, okay, I will do it, but before I do it, I need you and every single Jewish person that you can find. I need for you guys to fast and pray on my behalf before I enter into this for 3 days, day and night, no eating, no drinking. That's what we're going to do. We're going to fast and we're going to pray. So this is when we were talking about a couple of weeks. I think this might have even been in our after meeting. And we were talking about how in fasting and praying, it's literally saying no to food. So they did this for 3 days and 3 nights. And she said, you know, if I perish, shall I perish? But she knew that going into this, that she was going to be consecrated, not just herself, but by those that were around her. And that's where I want to talk about. There's also power in numbers, because she knew, I can't do this on my own. It is not by my will. It is not by my might, but it is by God. And I need you guys to come into agreement with me on this. We need to all stand in agreement. And so I'm thinking that all the Jewish people that Mordecai found and were on this fast with her, how powerful was that? If we can, in this day and age, agree in the same fashion that they did for not just Esther, but for their entire lives, their lineage to be saved, they were willing to put it all on the line. Like, what if we today gathered and band together on certain issues? If it was somebody who needed something done, like, you know what, we're going to fast and pray day and night for 3 days straight. And this wasn't like from a 6 to 6 to 6 to 2. This is 3 days straight, no eating at all. We are not going to eat or drink for 3 days, but we are going to fast and pray together for a certain thing. How many things can be moved on earth if we decided to come together and band against the will of the enemy in that fashion? So they did this. They go 3 days, 3 nights without eating. They're fasting and they're praying. And I don't want to just say not eating, because it's not just like, oh, I'm just not going to have a meal. It's intentional fasting. So they went on this intentional fast and prayer for 3 days, consecrated themselves, got themselves together, went to God to get wisdom and direction. And Esther said, if I perish, I perish, but I'm going to stand for what is right. So she then goes into the king's court. The king reaches out his scepter to her. And he says, like, whatever it is that you ask, even if you ask for half of my kingdom, I will give it to you. She's like, nope, I just want you to come to a banquet. I want you to bring Haman and I want you guys to come to a banquet. I'm going to create a feast for you guys. So she is preparing the table in advance to not even say, like, I want Haman to die right now. She just begins to just simply put out things to the king so that she knows, again, because why? Esther has a beautiful heart. Her insides are pure. So they go through these 3 days. Again, Haman has become so vexed by Mordecai. This is when he goes back to his wife and his friends, and he's basically telling them all of what's going to happen. And they're like, yep, set the gallows, get it ready, because Mordecai, you should have the king say that Mordecai can be hung from this gallows. So Haman goes to the king, is kind of telling him, well, if someone does this, don't you think that this should happen to them? And he's like, yep, that's exactly what should happen to him, not knowing or understanding that it's going to be Mordecai. That night, the king was unable to sleep. And so the king had someone come and read him a book of all of kind of the things that had happened throughout his time as king, all of the positive and good things. And in there, it was read to him, you know, Mordecai told you about these 2 people who were going to assassinate you. And he said, was anything ever done for Mordecai? Like, did we ever acknowledge him? Did we ever, you know, pay him or give him anything for extending that information? And they were like, no, nothing was ever done. So he was like, no, you know, we need to do something for him. Again, so how Mordecai had told Esther that she was created for such a time as this, I truly believe that God did not allow the king to get sleep so that he can bring back to his remembrance what Mordecai had done for him. Sometimes people do stuff for us and we don't always acknowledge or remember it, but God will bring it back to your remembrance when you need it. And so he goes and he starts telling Haman, like, we're going to do this for Mordecai. And so Haman's like, oh, that's the one I was supposed to kill. So he goes back and tells his wife and his friends what's going to happen, and they become shaken. But he's also still boasting because Queen Esther has invited him to this feast. So the time comes, they go to the feast, and again, the king tells Esther, whatever it is that you're asking of me, whatever it is that you want, I will give you. And so basically she says, well, what would happen if somebody said that they were going to kill me and all of my people? What comes of this? Like, what would you do? I think that something should happen. And so he's like, absolutely. Like, who would ever say to kill the queen and all of her people? And she's like, him, Haman. And the king became so furious that the same gallows that Haman had created to hang Mordecai on became the thing that he was killed on. So that's the Grimshaw version. I encourage you to read it for yourself, of course. But some things that I got from this is that courage, is that Esther decided to stand up for what was right, regardless as to if she was going to actually die, physically die, lose her soul, spirit, be gone, out of here, deuces. She decided, I'm going to stand for what is right. What else can we take from this is the importance, and I cannot stress the importance of fasting and praying. This is a prime example, and we've seen fasting. We've talked about fasting in some other of the people that we've talked about in the Bible, but this is, again, remembering the importance of fasting and praying. And so I remember I encouraged us all to reevaluate how we are fasting and when we are fasting and how we are coming into agreement whenever there is a fast collectively amongst us. Now, if you're fasting on your own, that's between you and God. But if we are going to collectively fast, there are ways in which we have to do this. God has not led me to do a collective fast, but whenever he does, I'm glad that we now have these blueprints and these stepping stones that we can go to when we decide to do that, because there is power in that. And how using your position for God and influence for the positive thing. Esther didn't just say, hey, I just want to save myself and save Mordecai. She said, no, I want to save my people. How when God is pushing us to do something, that there is going to be an influence that is going to be bigger than us. There are going to be people who are saved because of our yes and because of our obedience. So because of Esther's yes and because of her obedience, she was able to then go on and to save an entire lineage of people. At this time, God had already said that, that Jesus, or we didn't even know he was Jesus at the time, but that salvation would come through the Jews. So just think that if the enemy's plan was to annihilate the Jews, we never would have received salvation through Jesus, because they would have been annihilated based on one man and the influence that he had and the influence that his wife and friends had on him. The other thing is trusting God's timing, because up until this point, Esther had never said that she was of Jewish descent. She had never said that she was a Hebrew. She had never disclosed that information. She could have, but it was for such a time as this, it was God's timing of when it happened that she said this, because had she said it before, maybe Haman's plans would have changed, or maybe Haman would have come up with something different. But because he didn't have this type of knowledge, God had allowed her to keep this secret. Mordecai had encouraged her to keep this, not in secret, but not to disclose it, was so important. So God's timing is always right. So sometimes, and I know we talked about this again, and this is how these reoccurring themes are coming up, is that everything isn't always meant to be shared right away. Like trusting God's timing and adhere to his voice and have the obedience to be able to speak when it is that he's telling you to do so. The other thing is the planning and strategy, is that Esther, although she knew what was happening and what was going on, she still had plans. She had the guidance and the wisdom of Mordecai to be able to plan what was going to happen. And it was Esther's call of, hey, we're going to fast and we're going to pray for 3 days. So going into certain situations in our lives, we need to make sure that we are fasting and praying and getting God's plan and strategy for how it is that he wants us to execute certain things. The other thing is that there is power in number and unity, and we just talked about that when we just said the collective fasting and praying. The last thing I want to talk about is the pride of Haman, because of Mordecai not bowing down, and how pride is so tricky and sneaky, and how the enemy was able to use Haman and the pride that he had against an entire lineage of people, because they wouldn't bow down to him, or because they wouldn't bow down to the king. Like, that right there shows you how sometimes what you think, like, I think I'm right and you think you're right, but ultimately, if it's not what God says is right, it doesn't matter. And so he was going against what God said. Don't have any other gods before me. The Jewish people were doing what was right by God. So in the end, they were the ones who actually saw the goodness of God. They were the ones who were saved because of their adherence and obedience to what God has said. So they did not allow their own fear to come in the way and make them bow down. They didn't allow their own pride to say, well, you know what? We're boasting about the situation. No, we're just simply following the laws of God. That's it. So that's what I have for us. I'm going to end this meeting and we're going to start our collective group meeting.